What is up, my friends, and thanks so much for tuning back in. Welcome to the second exciting installment of the AI Guitar YouTube series with your host, that is Alex, and today we're going to be continuing from where we left off from last time. If you were tuned in, if you do recall, what we were learning last time was a lot of major music theory, both major and minor. What we're going to be doing today is translating that theory into the guitar, and we're going to be learning the 7 modes of the major scale, or the diatonics, as I called them last time. We're going to be learning the major scales all the way up the fretboard, both horizontally and vertically, and we're going to be doing that via a really simple, intuitive system called the Ionian system that I've developed. What that is 5 rules of how to learn those 7 modes, learning all the logics and all of the patterns that come with it. And so while I teach you all of the 7 modes, that's going to be coming in this video today, I'm going to be introducing you to those 5 rules. So strap yourselves in and buckle up, we're going to get started in just a second. But before I get started, I'm going to give you a short introduction on what we're going to be doing. And also, if you like the video, please consider liking the video, please subscribe and leave your thoughts in the comment section below. But let's get down to it. So a short little introduction is in order. So today what we're going to be doing with this Ionian system is we're going to be learning the 7 modes of the major scale with 3 note per string scales. So what that means is we're going to be learning 3 notes on each of the 6 strings. So that means there's going to be 18 notes, 6 times 3, 18. So it's not just a clean mode scale. So it's not just going to be the 8 notes, 7 plus a tonic. It's going to be a little bit more different, but in fact, it's going to be a little bit easier to digest this because with 3 notes on each string, it is very, very consistent and quite simple in this sense. Another thing as well, we're going to be learning the 7 modes in the key of E major. So what this means is we're going to basically learn it with the guitar in mind, as this is pretty much tuned into the E tuning. Another thing as well is in this video I've got a lot of overlays and videos that will be helping you learn the scales. So I'm going to show you some videos of myself playing the scales, both with my wrist over here with my left hand and also with the picking in my right. I'm going to show you all the tabs and the fretboard diagrams to help you on your way. What I would recommend to everybody here today that doesn't know about these 7 modes, I would recommend playing along and learning as you go, and also playing the video back a few times until it really does start to click, because with a little bit of practice, a little bit of dedication, it's going to be really, really simple. It's going to make your fretboard knowledge really, really second nature. So stay put, stay tuned, we're going to get started right away. So part 1 of this video, we're going to be doing 2 things while we're learning Ionian rule number 1. So first of all, we're going to be learning the simple Ionian major scale, the most generic major scale that you can learn. We're going to be doing that both vertically and horizontally first. We're going to do it both in terms of the 3 note per string scale, and we're going to also do a 1 string scale. So first of all, I'm going to show you a brief little video on screen now of myself playing the major scale, the Ionian scale as it's called. I'm going to show you 2 iterations of this. I'm going to show you both the open string scale, and then I'm also going to show you the one on the 12th fret, so you can see it both fretted and with some open strings. So what I want you to do is look at this video and play along if you can. So I'll see you in just a moment. So there you have it. That was the Ionian scale, both the open string versions and the fretted versions. What we're going to now do is just take a quick closer look at the fretting of that scale, and what we're going to then do is find the first rule of the Ionian system via that scale. So yeah, let's take a look at the fretboard here. So as you'll see, we've got 6 strings. Let's look at the first 2 strings. So you'll see here that the first 2 strings, the E string and A string, they both have the exact same fretting shape being used. They happen to have a fretting arrangement where there's a space in between each note. What I'm going to do is I'm going to refer to that particular shape as the I shape in this video. That's going to be part of this rule. Next, when you get to the D and the G string, there's another set of double fretting arrangements. This is what I'm going to call the L shape. And then finally, on the B and the bottom E string, there's a final 3rd fretting shape that emerges, what I'm going to call the A shape. All of the 7 modes of the major scales that we'll be talking about today, all of them happen to share this in common. They all have all 3 of these shapes appearing in a certain order. The exact order itself we'll talk about later on in this video. It's a very simple order. Just for the moment, what I want you to do is bear with this simple concept. So in all 7 modes of the major scales, they all will be using these 3 shapes. The I shape, that first one, the L shape, that second one in the middle, and finally the A shape. There's a reason for why I've called these particular fretting patterns these particular letters. The first one, the I shape, and the reason for why I've called that the I shape is because it happens to take after certain aspects of the Ionian scale. So the Ionian scale not only starts with, but also it doubles that particular I shape. Shape number 2, the L shape. The reason why I've called that the L shape is because the Locrian, which also starts with an L, it starts with and doubles that particular shape. And finally, the third shape, the A shape. The reason why I've called that one the A shape is because the Aeolian mode, which also starts with an A, not only starts with that, but also it doubles that. Additionally, these 3 particular scales, the reason for why these are also pretty prominent in the 7 modes is because they also happen to be the generics of their kind, or at least the sole mode of their kind in the case of Locrian. So Ionian is the generic major, the Aeolian is the generic minor, and finally the Locrian is the only half diminished mode out of the 7. Another way in which we can say that the Ionian scale is a reference point, a natural reference for us today, the Ionian shape itself happens to go specifically in that order, I-L-A. So it's such a friendly way in which we can refer back to some sort of reference point. So the Ionian scale itself with the double I, the double L and the double A, it's really frustrating because that order itself that I've just quoted, it's really close to what will become the universal shape order within all the 7 modes. I won't talk too much about it, but I will just make that remark about it. But yeah, stay tuned and you'll see what I'm talking about. Just one more little piece of bonus trivia that I will include here. The fretting arrangements with both the I and the L shapes all use the index finger, the middle finger and the pinky finger. And it's only the Aeolian shape that uses the first finger, the index finger, the ring finger, and finally the pinky finger. Although I have included it within my tab because I label the fretting fingers within the tabs above the notes. That's just a passing reference. And then finally, just in regards to the Ionian scale regarding where to place it on the fretboard, we will talk a lot more about placing modes on the fretboard in the context of E major. Because the Ionian scale is the first mode, and from the first interval, because it's the E major, we can place it either on the open string or the 12th fret. So to summarize, Euler rule number 1 is as follows. There are 3 common and sole fretting shapes within all 7 of the major modes within a 3-note per string format, and they are named after the Ionian, Locrian, and Aeolian modes based on how they both A, start with, and B, double those particular fretting shapes. Next, we're going to be talking about the horizontal 1-string major scale. The reason for why we're going to be doing this as a little bonus scale is not only do we want to know the exact notes that we'll be playing, and doing it in just 1 string in 1 dimension would be very clear for us, but also it will train our ear a little bit, because when we're just doing it with less complications with multiple strings and so on, we really start to develop a sense for every single note. So next up, take a look at this 1-string major scale, both with my fretting and with my picking, and play along if you can. Take a look. So there was the 1-string scale, the 1-string Ionian scale. To remember back to our first video on major music theory, the Ionian scale, the generic major scale, as I would often call it in that video, simply goes whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. So now we've talked about the horizontal Ionian scale. What we can now do is talk about Euler rule number 2, which basically gets all of its reference from that 1-string scale that we just saw. So Euler rule number 2 is as follows. Every 7 intervals of the major scale have 7 counterpart, overlapping, and distinct mode scales. So clearly that's going to be the easiest and simplest Euler rule to remember, potentially. What I'd recommend that you do with that 1-string Ionian scale is to commit to memory a triplet version of that same scale. And what I mean by that is basically taking each interval and just playing the next 2 intervals in line. And then once you get to the second interval, you play the 3rd and 4th. And then once you get to the 3rd, play the 4th and 5th, and so on. A little bit of an optional bonus at this point in the video. What I will do is I will return to this point later down the line with Euler rule number 4. This is where it sort of returns once again. But to move nicely along with that 1-string Ionian scale, what we're now going to do is make a roadmap of all the modes, all of the 7 modes in order. So every time you take an interval of the 1-string scale, you are effectively mapping out not only how every single mode begins in terms of its fret, so for example the Dorian starts in the 2nd fret, but what you are also doing is mapping out and specifying how every mode also starts in terms of its Euler shape. Let's return to this a little bit later on in the video. What I just want you all to look into at this point in the video is that nice little road map, the mode map of the mode zones, if you will. So let's have a look at the virtual fretboard and let's discuss this next. First and foremost, our first interval on our open E string starts with the mother scale, the E Ionian mode. Next up, our second interval and our second fret, we've got the F sharp Dorian mode. Next up, our third interval and fourth fret on the E string, we have our G sharp Phrygian mode. Next up, on the fifth fret, our fourth interval, the A Lydian mode. Next up, the fifth interval and the seventh fret on the E string has our B Mixolydian mode. For our sixth interval, on the ninth fret, we've got our C sharp Aeolian mode. And finally, our 11th fret and our 7th interval, we have the D sharp Locrian mode. So there we've got it. We've mentally mapped out our fretboard in the E major context. When it comes to the major modes, they will all start on an I shape. Similarly as well, all of the darkest modes, both the Locrian and the Phrygian, they all start on an L shape, and then finally the brightest minor modes, both the Aeolian mode and the Dorian mode, they both happen to start on an A shape. This idea of brightness and darkness, although it's sort of slightly playing a theme so far, that's going to be a little bit later on in this video. So once again, there are several patterns that we can start seeing taking shape within the modes. We're going to start talking about the darkness and brightness pattern a little bit later on in the video, but just have that for reference. There are various ways in which we can already start seeing plenty of patterns emerging. So now we've talked about I level 1 and 2, as well as the Ionian scale, both the vertical and the horizontal version. We can now talk about the Locrian scale, our second mode. So technically, the Locrian scale is the 7th in line. There's a reason for why we're going to learn this one second. So number one, as you've already seen, all of our three shapes, they all reference a certain scale, and one of those, of course, is the Locrian scale. Number two, it happens to be right next door to the Aeolian scale. It just happens to be backwards in order. So instead of going number 1 and then number 2 to Dorian, I'll be going number 1 and backwards to number 7. It's just the other way around that we're going to do the order of. And finally, number 3, kind of like we already talked about, the Locrian scale is another one of our generics. Locrian scale is going to be the next one that's easiest to remember. So just like before, just like the Ionian scale, what I'm going to now do is show you the Locrian scale, both in terms of the fretting and the picking. Follow along as best as you can, and I will see you once again in just a second. So there was the Locrian scale, our second in order. What we're now going to want to do now that we've seen the video playthrough is start mentally analysing those fretting rules once again, and we can start doing that via the first rule of the Euler system. So once again, let's take a look at our virtual fretboard and start taking a look at these fretting rules for the Locrian mode. So as we can see, with the Euler rule number 1, with our 3 fundamental and lone shapes, we can start seeing, once again, just like the Ionian scale, we've got a series of 3 doubled shapes. So the Ionian scale, when II, LL, and AA. The Locrian scale, in this case, happens to go LL, AA, and finally II. And then finally, regarding the Locrian scale and how to place it onto the fretboard, we can use either rule number 2 and the reference 1 string major scale in order to understand exactly where we can place it. So the Locrian scale is the 7th mode, and it's from the 7th interval. The 7th interval in the context of E major is the 11th fret and the D sharp. So we know, just like the mode says on screen right now, that it's on the 11th fret. So now that we've talked about those first two, we're now going to proceed to the final third mother reference scale, if you will, the Aeolian scale, the natural minor scale. Once again, I'm going to play you through the Aeolian scale, just like the Locrian and the Ionian. I'm going to show you the fretting, I'm going to show you the picking. I'll see you in just a second after you've seen the playthrough. there you have it. So once again, let's jump over to the virtual fretboard to start analysing the Aeolian mode. So we've correlated the Ionian and the Locrian. We're now going to start talking about how those two are quite similar to the Aeolian. So just like all of those that we've talked about, they doubled and started on a particular shape. The Aeolian, similarly, starts on a particular shape and doubles a particular shape. The only thing that marks it off as a little bit distinct from the Aeolian and the Locrian is it doesn't just double 3 shapes cleanly. What it technically does is it doubles one, doubles the A, it then triples the I, and then it finalizes with one lone L shape. Now, this is significant in our video because this is actually mapping out
our third rule, our Euler rule number 3.
So the reason for why Ionian and Locrian was so similar was because not only are they doubling 3 shapes really cleanly in a nice little order, but they are doubling them in a particular loop. So instead of ILA, it could be LAI, back to the start and so on. The Aeolian clarifies the universal hard rule of shapes from this point onwards. So every mode that we're going to talk about, from Aeolian, Mixolydian, Lydian, and so on until we reach the end, they all will start using a new kind of order. And finally, regarding the Aeolian scale in terms of where to place it on the fretboard, we can use the Euler rule number 2 and the 1-string major scale reference scale in terms of where to place it in the context of E major. So the Aeolian mode is the 6th mode in order, so that means it must come from the 6th interval. The 6th interval in the E major scale is the C sharp, and the C sharp happens to be on the 9th fret. So Euler rule number 3 is as follows. The universal shape order using those 3 fretting shapes, I, L, and A, happens to be I, L, L, A, A. So in this case, the Aeolian mode happens to start on those AA shapes, and then it loops back around onto the triple I before finalizing on one of those 2 L's, because there are 6 strings instead of 7, but there are 7 shapes in an order in this case. It can't use all of them because of how many strings there are, but in this case, it uses as many of them before it starts to run out. So in this case, it happens to be AA, I, and then 1 L. So that's the rule number 3. So once again, the Ionian and the Locrian were almost there, but the Aeolian clarifies the rule for us from this point onwards. So when we start talking about Mixolydian and Lydian and Phrygian, it will use that particular order rather than the double that we saw in Ionian and Locrian. So now we've talked about both Euler rule number 1, 2, and 3. And we've talked about the mother scales in this system. We're now going to start talking about the 4th mode, the Mixolydian, and the 2nd major mode of our 7. So what I'll do, I'll jump straight into this. I will show you how the Mixolydian mode is played, both with the fretting and with the tab. So stay tuned, have a look, and I'll see you in just a moment. So there was the Mixolydian scale, the 4th mode, and it's also the 2nd major mode. So let's talk about the virtual fretboard one more time. So nice and easy, quick and simple, you'll find that it starts just like the Euler rule number 3 order of shape starts, with a triple I. So nice and easy for you to follow. This is actually quite a nice one to start with after our first 3, our first reference scales, if you will. So yeah, starts on that triple I, and then a double L, and then finally an A. It would be 2 A's, but there's 6 strings rather than 7 shapes in this case. So Euler rule number 1, we can see that it's literally following the 3 fundamental fretting shapes because it's literally using I, L, and A in certain orders. Euler rule number 2, we can tell that it's starting on the 7th fret because the 5th interval of the E major scale is on the 7th fret, the B in this case. That's how we can map out the Mixolydian scale in the context of E major. Finally, with Euler rule number 3, while we can say that we can observe it's following that exact order of shape appearance, I, LL, and A, just like the Aeolian mode established, the problem so far with Euler rule number 3 is alone, it can't tell us how every mode should start. So now we've talked about the Mixolydian mode, we can now start thinking about our 4th Euler rule number 4, and it's with reference to that particular mode and the next ones that follow that we then take our cue for this 4th rule. So earlier in the video we said that all the major modes started on an I shape. We can say that's true but it doesn't show us which particular mode starts on how many I's. Because the Ionian is the double, that means that therefore the Lydian and Mixolydian are either 1 or 3. And how are we supposed to know that? Well, there's a way in which we can start thinking about that in a logical way. So what I'm now going to do is specify and state clearly what exactly the fourth rule of the Euler system is. So Euler rule number 4 is as follows. In order to work out what mode starts with what shape and however many of them, you take the darkest to brightest major, and then secondly, the darkest to brightest non-major. Just specify it in numerical terms. The first I is Mixolydian, the second I is Ionian, and the third I is the Lydian. The first L is the Locrian, the second L is the Phrygian, the first A is the Aeolian, and then finally the second A is the Dorian. Just like Euler rule number 3 has a certain rule of ordering, this has a certain rule of ordering that goes from darkest to brightest in a certain sense. So it goes from dark to bright and then dark to bright one more time. So as strange and as quirky as that order is, it does make perfect sense because it all starts following that certain kind of ordering. So it starts ordering in terms of I, L, and A, the triple and the double double. This goes dark, bright, and it never fails. So from this point on, now that we've talked about those rules and those scales, we're now going to start thinking about the final 4. So the 5th mode and the 3rd final major mode of the 7 diatonic scales, we've got the Lydian scale. So just as before, I'm going to show you both the fretting and the picking of how this scale should go, and I will talk to you in just a moment. So there is the playthrough of the Lydian scale. So let's now talk about the scale with the virtual fretboard, and we'll start analysing it in terms of Euler's rule number 1, 2, 3, and 4. So with the first rule of the Euler system, we can start thinking about the Lydian scale following those 3 fundamental fretting forms. So Euler rule number 2 is next. So with Euler rule number 2, just like we learned last time with the 1-string major scale, as well as the mode map, we know that for every 7 intervals of the major scale, there is a corresponding mode. So in this case, if you remember from the last video, we've got the standard mode order starting from the C natural context, and we abbreviated that into the 7 letters of I, D, P, L, M, A, L, and that was I don't particularly like modes a lot. So in this case, we've got I don't particularly like, so that's the 4th interval, and that's the 4th mode, so that's the Lydian. And in this case, with the E major context, it's on the 5th fret. So that tells us, therefore, that the 5th fret is where we start our Lydian scale. Euler rule number 3, we've got a certain order of shapes that it follows. So starting from the 3rd I in the universal order, we've got I, L, L, A, A, and finally another I, looping back around to the beginning. And then third and finally, we've got a certain bright, dark order. So it starts with darkest to brightest major, and then it finally goes to darkest to brightest non-major. So in this case, perfectly enough, it goes 1 I, 2 L's, 2 A's, and finally 1 more I. So once again, we can bring a certain kind of order and certain kind of predictability to all of these modes using these rules in this order. We can see that most of the logic in terms of naturally intuiting these modes on the fretboard are really starting to take shape. Coming up next, we've got the Phrygian scale, the 2nd minor mode out of 3 that we'll talk about today. Let's talk about how to fret the Phrygian scale. So Euler rule number 1, we know that we've got the I, L, and A shapes. Euler rule number 2, we know that we can fret out the Phrygian mode on the 3rd interval, because it's the 3rd mode. And the 3rd interval on the E string is going to be the 4th fret. So therefore, we know that it's G sharp Phrygian. Euler rule number 3, we know that we've got the hard order of I, L, L, and AA. But using Euler rule number 4, we know that we've got 1 L, 2 A's, and finally 2 I's, following that shape order from dark, bright, dark, bright. So in this case, we know that the Phrygian scale is going to be G sharp in the context of E major. We know it's on the 4th fret, and we know that it starts in that particular fretting shape arrangement, which once again is L, AA, I. And then finally, we've got the Dorian mode. We've got the final mode that we'll talk about today, and the 3rd and final minor mode. So let's use the Euler system in terms of how to fret the Dorian mode. So Euler rule number 1, we just know that we've got those 3 shapes that we must use in a 3-note per string scale. Euler rule number 2, we know that the Dorian mode is the second mode in the normal order. So that means it's the second interval of the E major scale, which happens to be the second fret. So it's the F sharp that we will have in the E major context. Euler rule number 3, we know that the hard order of shape appearance is III, LL, and AA. Rule number 4, we know that the Dorian scale is the brightest non-major mode. So in this case, it's the 7th shape that it must start on. So in this case, it must start on an A shape, and then it should be followed up by 3 I's, and then finally 2 L's. Therefore, we know that the Dorian scale, the F-sharp Dorian scale, starts on the 2nd fret, starts on an A, and then follows up III, and then finally LL. And it's as simple as that. So now that we've gone through all of the modes, what we're going to do before we go any further onto our rule number 5 is we're going to talk about
The usefulness of the 3 rules.
if in fact you didn't get so much out of rule number 4. In this case, if you were a little bit light on music theory, so for example, if you don't know the scale of bright and darkness, so if you didn't know that the Lydian was the brightest and the Locrian was the darkest in this case, what I'm now going to slightly do is talk about a different understanding and different interpretation of the first 3 rules of the Euler system that will help you specifically. It's a way in which you can get some benefit out of the first 3 rules, but at the end of the day, in the long run, learning the 4 rules is going to be better. But let's talk about how you can use the first 3 rules, Euler's rule number 1, 2, and 3. So let's start this in order. So let's say that we know that the first rule of the Euler system was that the Ionian, the Locrian, and the Aeolian, those were the only 3 shapes that started on a double, either a double I, a double L, or a double A. Euler rule number 2, we know that we've got the 7 intervals and we've got the 7 modes. All of those 7 intervals will start on a certain shape to complete the first 3 notes of their respective mode scales. So in this case, if we've got the triplet scale of the 1-string scale, every single mode we know at least starts on a certain 3-note shape. So for example, if we filter out the Ionian, the Locrian, and the Aeolian, because we know that those are the only ones that start on a double, we're only left therefore with at least 2 modes that start on one single shape. With the non-generic majors, it's a bit of a complication, we'll talk about that last. But in this case, let's talk about the Dorian and the Phrygian. So with the Dorian, first of all, if we know that the Aeolian was the only mode that started on a double A shape, that leaves only 1 left that starts on a single A shape. So as a factor of elimination, using Euler rule number 1 and Euler rule number 2, we know that the Dorian mode is our only one based on the triplet version of the 1-string scale. We know that that starts on an A shape. And based on Euler rule number 3, we know that the sole A shape must then be completed by 3 I's and 2 L's. And then finally, in this case, we've got the Phrygian mode. And we know that the Locrian mode was the only one that started on a double L. So in this case, we know that there's 1 left that starts on a single L. And using the triplet version of the 1-string scale from Euler rule number 2, we know that the Phrygian mode must be starting on 1 L. So if we know that there's 1 L, we know that in that case, it must be fulfilled by a double A and then some order of I's. So in this case, let's talk about it in real time. So we've got 1 L, 2 A's, and then finally 3 I's. And that's how that goes. So we know that based on Euler rule number 1, Euler rule number 2, and finally Euler rule number 3, we can fulfill not only how they start, but how they complete based on all of those first 3 Euler rules combined. The only problem, and this is where I would recommend that you use Euler rule number 4 still, at least in the long term, is with the Lydian and the Mixolydian, there's no real way of intuiting whether it's a triple I in the Mixolydian case or a single I in the Lydian case. In this case, technically, you can just simply remember that the Mixolydian is unique in the sense that it's the only mode out of all 7 that uses a triple start. In this case, it is I. And you can remember that based on Euler rule number 3, that one shape in particular must start on a triple I. You could just say that for argument's sake, you could just bootstrap the fact that the Mixolydian is the only triple and it must be a triple I in this case. It is a harder way of remembering it. So rule 4 is a much more flexible, a much more sophisticated rule, a lot more self-contained. Strictly speaking, I won't lie, if you know how to, you can combine the first 3 rules to get you quite far. You'll have a lot of mileage to do it, but the only problem is you are inevitably going to have to remember that the Mixolydian starts in a triple. You could say that's pretty easy, but in this case, I prefer a lot more simple rules. So now we've talked about all the 7 modes of the major scale. What we can finally do is now talk about the 5th and final rule of this system, which is going to be talking about some of the fretting deviations and fretting oddities that you may have already noticed in all of the modes that we've talked about today. So what we're going to now do is look at all of the modes on screen. We're going to talk about the Ionian, the Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, Aeolian, and Locrian, all in order. And we'll discuss all of the fretting rules and all of the fretting oddities that we can notice. So let's take a look at it. So with all the 7 modes in front of us, let's look at them all in order. So let's start off with the first mode, that is the Ionian scale. So with the Ionian scale, from the E and the A, they all start on the same fret. In this case, it's just simply the open string. But as soon as you get to the D string and onwards, you jump by 1 fret. So in this case, with the D string, it starts on the first fret rather than the 0 fret. And then secondly, once you get to the B string, you'll see that there's yet another fret jump from the D string and onwards, in which case, at the very end of the scale, while it started on the 0 fret or the open string, it ends on the 2nd string. So we've got a series of fret jumps that accrue together. So from the D string and then finally on the B string, they jump by 1 fret each. In this case, it's a 2 fret gap in total. Next, we've got the Dorian scale. So the Dorian scale in the context of E major, which is the F sharp Dorian, it starts on the 2nd fret. In this case, as we can see, unlike the Ionian scale, which has 2 instances of fret jumps, this just simply has 1 instance of any kind of fret jump. But unlike the Ionian scale, which has 2 instances of 1 fret jump each, this has 1 instance of a double fret jump. So it started on the 2nd fret all the way up until the B string, where in fact it's 2 frets jump at this particular instance. Next up, we've got the Phrygian scale, which in this case, with the E major scale, it's the G sharp Phrygian on the 4th fret. In this case, as we can see, from the E string all the way up until the G string, they will all start their sequence of Euler shapes on the same fret, the 4th fret in this case. But as soon as they get to the B string, just like the Ionian and the Dorian modes, we know that there's a fretting jump that takes place there. However, unlike the Ionian and unlike the Dorian, there is only 1 fret jump that takes place here. So unlike those other two, there is only 1 instance of any kind of jump. In this case, with all of the fretting differences accrued between the 4th fret and everything else, it's only 1 fret difference in total. We can see that the B string is where there is some sort of natural fretting jump taking place with every mode so far. Coming up next, we've got the Lydian scale. In the context of E major, that would be the Aeolian scale, the 4th interval, and the 5th fret. We can see there's quite a few fretting jumps taking place. In this case, just like the Ionian scale, it's not simply from the B string. In this case, unlike the G string, it's actually taking place first of all from the A string, and then of course ending up on the B string. But of course, just like every mode so far, we can see that there's a grand total of 2 fretting rules between the first E string and the final E string. They just happen to be from the A string and then finally the B string. Coming up next, we've got the Mixolydian scale, which is our 5th mode. In this case, with the E major context, that would be the B Mixolydian scale. In this case, we can see quite a few fretting oddities taking place. So just like the Ionian scale and just like the Lydian scale, there's quite a few staggered fretting jumps taking place. So in this case, we can see that from the G string and then secondly with the B string, there are 2 successive singular fretting jumps taking place, 1 plus 1. Next up, we've got the 6th mode, which is the Aeolian scale. With the E major context, that would be the C sharp Aeolian scale from the 9th fret. In this case, we can see a few staggered jumps one more time. So just like before, just like all of them, for example, we've got a 1 fret jump, or at least 1 fret jump, sometimes it's 2, from the B string and onwards. However, uniquely, and this is the first time this has happened from our observation, we can see that from the final string, the E string, there is another jump taking place there too. And then finally, we've got the 7th mode, which is our Locrian scale. And in the context of the E major, that would be the D sharp Locrian scale. Let's have a look at the fretting rules one more time. So just like before, just like every single scenario so far that we've got a fretting jump on that B string. However, just like the Phrygian scale, that is the only fretting jump. So in the other 5 scales, we can see that there's at least a combined or 2 singular fretting jumps. With the context of the Phrygian, and in this case, the Locrian scale, the 2 darkest in this case, funnily enough, there is only 1 fretting jump. So what we're now going to do, now that we've talked about all those 7 modes and all their fretting rules, we're now going to talk about exactly what the 5th rule is of our Euler system. Because the 5th rule of the Euler system aims to make all of these fretting oddities nice and predictable and easy to understand. Euler number 5 as well, uniquely in our system, it's the only Euler rule which has 2 distinct parts in it. It's an A and a B. But in this case, it's quite simple, so it doesn't require 2 rules. It's just 2 parts of the same coin, if that makes sense. So Euler rule number 5 is as follows. Part A, once you reach the B string, you jump by 1 fret, and then part B, once you've got to the final I shape in the universal order, you jump by 1 fret as well. These 2 rules, parts A and part B, do stack amongst themselves. So now we've got the 5th rule of the Euler system under our belts. What we're now going to do is jump back to those 7 modes one more time to look at those fretting oddities with those 2 sub-rules in mind. So once again, let's look at them in order. So starting off with the Ionian scale, we can see that there is a jump with B string and the D string. Before I look at this and every other scale, I can just say quite plainly right now that every single one of these modes is subject to Euler 5 part A, which is to say that every time you get to the B string, you do have a fret jump. And that is simply just because inherently the B string is tuned differently to all of the other strings. In this case, instead of 5 semitones, it's 4 semitones between it and its former string. So with the Ionian scale, we can see that there is another jump that isn't simply on the B string, which is on the D string, and that is after you've got the final I shape taking place in the order. Therefore, we can say that Aeolian number 5 part A is taking place because there is simply a B string. And then finally, there is a jump from the D string because the former string contains the final I shape in the rule 3 order of shapes. Let's have a look at the Dorian scale number 2. So once again, we can remember that the Dorian scale was rather unique in the sense that it only had one instance of any kind of fret jump. With Aeolian number 5 part A and part B, we can see that both of those rules are actually taking place on the B string itself, because number one, you've simply got the existence of the B string, but with Aeolian 5 part B, that particular string happens to be after the final I shape of the hard order of shapes from Aeolian number 3. So that's why there's a double jump from the B string. Let's look at the Phrygian scale next. So having a look at the strings and having a look at the shapes, we can see that there is one fretting jump, which is on the B string, but that is the only and the sole fretting jump at all, because in fact we can see that there's only 2 I shapes, there is no final I, and there is no time in which we've got Aeolian 5 part B taking place. So that's nice and simple. That is only one of 2 scales out of the 7 where there is only one fret jump ever taking place, and by default it happens to be Aeolian 5 part A, where it's simply just because there's a B string involved. Next, let's talk about the Lydian scale. So of course we've got 2 instances of any fretting jumps. We've got the one where there's a B string, and there's one where there's the final I shape taking place. So simply, this is why we've got an accrued difference of 2 frets between the first string and the last string. It's simply because Aeolian 5 part A and Aeolian 5 part B are taking place in 2 different instances. In the first case, it's simply the B string rule, and then finally we've got one where a final I shape is taking place on the E string. One separate jump at each time. It's simply 1 plus 1. It's not like the Dorian scale. Next, we've got the Mixolydian scale again. So let's have a look at the fretting distinctions. So from the G string and the B string, there are 2 separate instances of a single fret jump each. And of course, we know why. So Aeolian rule number 5 part A, we know that the B string will always have a fret jump. But in this case, because on the D string, there is the final I shape in the hard order, Aeolian rule number 3, we know that that is the reason for why there's a fret jump on the G string specifically. So once again, we've got 2 staggered and separate instances of one singular fret jump in each of those strings. In this case, it happens to be on the G string and the B string. Next, we've got the Aeolian scale. Let's take a look at the strings and let's look at the shapes. So from the B string, we know, of course, we've got that fretting jump. But then finally, uniquely, we've got the final one on the E string, which is pretty unusual. And we know that that's because on the B string, there is one final I shape in the hard order taking place. So of course, we know, therefore, we've got one fretting jump on the B string just because it is the B string and it's tuned differently. And then finally, we've got the second jump, which is the 5 part B. That's simply just because on the B string itself, it happens to be that final I shape in the rule number 3 sequence. And then finally, once again, let's look at the Locrian scale. So just like the Phrygian scale, we were saying that last time, this is the only time where there's only one fret distinction between the first string and the last string. And that is simply just because there is a B string, so in that case there is a Aeolian rule number 5 part A taking place, but there is no final I shape in the hard order, the rule number 3 order. There's only a second I shape, which is the top E string. So in this case, we can just simply say there is only one time where any of those 2 rules of the Aeolian number 5 are even taking place at all.
It just happens to be from the B string.
So with that all being said, we've now reached the end of the video. We've talked about all of the 5 rules of the Aeolian system. This was a particular condensation of the Aeolian system. There are technically more rules of how to figure out the modes in different kinds of ways. I'm going to leave that to a future video, but for today, those particular 5 rules that we've now just discussed are going to be pretty essential for understanding how to map out the modes in your head, both with the horizontal dimensionality and the vertical. So I will leave it here. I'm going to say thank you very much for getting to the end of this video. I hope you do stick around and I hope you subscribe to the channel. I will see you in the next installment. Have a lovely day. Take care and peace.